starting to set up?
Yes.
Okay, great.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. During this call, all attendees will be muted. If you haven't already done so, please enter your audio pin so we can control your audio. But it seems like everyone has done so. But if you feel like that's not the case, please press mute on your phone, and that should resolve that issue. The second thing is that we'll be fielding questions at the end of the webinar through the chat feature. So please write your questions clearly and indicate if you would like to address a specific panelist. I will read them during the Q&A portion of the webinar. The final point is, if you have any technical issues during this webinar, please send the chat directly to the organizer, or you can email Bianca Alston at balston, that's B-A-L-S-T-O-N, at ABFE, ABFE.org. Thank you, and thank you for your participation today, and I will be turning the webinar over to our moderator, Alvin Starks, now. Thank you.
And before we go to Alvin, this is Edward Jones. I'm Director of Programs for ABFE, the Association of Black Foundation Executives, and you just heard my colleague Natalie Diaz, also on staff with ABFE, and we want to welcome you to this webinar, and thank you for taking some time out to sit with us and chat and talk about some very timely topics in American history, particularly as they've impacted the African American and Black community. So Alvin Starks is our moderator, as mentioned today. He's with the Schaumburg Center in New York. And we have a great panel and a great conversation. So thank you for being a part of this. And take it away, Alvin.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We are all really excited to join you virtually to really talk about a series of events that I think that we all think are definitive towards social justice causes as it relates to Black communities. The webinar is entitled The Unfinished Business of Brown versus Board of Education, but you'll hear from our panelists that it's much broader and deeper than that. 2014 really does represent an important year, an anniversarial commemorative year as we think about civil rights achievements. For a whole host of reasons, looking at Brown v. Board, which turned 60 in May. We also are about to witness the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, which is July 2nd, and then Freedom Summer, which was in Mississippi, respectively, during the summer months of '64. All of these pieces really do tell us a very important narrative about America, but also about the larger social justice movement. What we're hoping to do in this conversation is to, one, give both a historical context, but two, to really talk about that arc, how we've moved forward from Brown, how we've moved forward from the Civil Rights Act, as well as Freedom Summer. And dare I say, how we've also moved back. I think one could really make a strong claim that the issues of Brown v. Board that were presented during the Warren's Court in '54 is radically different than the current court system of the Roberts Court. So we're going to have some conversation about what funders can actually do to really achieve racial equity. It's perfect to achieve racial equity in our current grant-making initiatives, as well as to really hear from leading advocates and funders on the ground. So our agenda for this afternoon is right in front of us, a welcome and a framing, and then I want to introduce our guest presentations, which will happen shortly, followed by an interactive Q&A, and then a closing. Next slide, please. Please mute your phones during the webinar. You are also able to really insert your questions and comments virtually through the audio chat form. Next slide, please. Right. So why don't we just start there? What we try to do is to really help people understand that these issues of history are always ever present. Though they may feel historic exclusively, they never really, quote unquote, went away. The question of Jim Crowism, the question of actually how we achieve civil rights, but also how do we make sure that they are long-standing. There have been a number of reports that have actually identified how issues of racial equity are disproportionate in the U.S. in particular for Black students. Next slide, please. We find that these issues are not exclusively just wedded to, we can say they're just wedded to issues of school education, but also they're thinking about democracy as a whole. When you look at the Shelby decision that happened in 2013 that begins to kind of eradicate portions of the Voting Rights Act, we're realizing that we're at a different place. And so the question before us is, what is the role of funders? What is the role of advocates to really move this work forward? Where are there levers of opportunity? How do we engage communities for organizing and policy reform? And also, what's the role of arts and culture? Next slide, please. So what you have in front of you will be a series of presentations by 4 phenomenal individuals. I really wish this was a talk show because they really have so much to share. First, we will hear from Felicia Dahani, who is with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a new Director of Education and Learning. Jonathan Stitt from the Alliance for Educational Justice. He is a national coordinator there working with grassroots groups. Judith Brown-Dianis, co-director of the Advancement Project, followed by Marcia Smith, former philanthropoid as well as president of Firelight Media. So I'd like to turn it over to Felicia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. We're very excited to be able to present today and be part of this webinar, and I will try my best to keep my time so that we can really get into the heated discussion later on and be able to answer some questions. So if we can move to the first slide, I'll give an overview of the work here at Kellogg. At the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, we really focus on the child, the optimal development of the child, and the areas that we have chosen to focus on is really around educating children, working to improve children and families and healthy outcomes, and secure families. So we see ourselves, well, we ask ourselves often, what are we doing and how best can we do the work to support vulnerable children and families? And how can we use our knowledge, our resources, our influences to really make the greatest difference for the children and families that we serve? And as an organization, the policies that we put in place to support not only our work, but to support the funds that we provide to programs to address the needs of these of children and families in a comprehensive way, we drive this through a community engagement and racial equity lens. And we really believe that the most meaningful and sustainable social change that we can support in communities really cannot be achieved unless and until the plight of vulnerable children and families improve. And we have decided to concentrate our resources in the areas of early childhood, specifically birth through 8, with the context of families and communities, and again, really focusing on the best opportunities, the opportunities that we feel are those pivotal points in the lives of children and families that we can address. And the overarching piece that I think is going to be really critical as we do this work, and I applaud being a new member of the Kellogg Foundation, the fact that, Kellogg has put race and equity at the forefront of all the work that we do. And we realized that we had a great mission and vision. But now that, we're seeing everything that we do, including funding through a racial equity lens, and really addressing structural racism and the consequences that structural racism has in communities and institutions that serve them is really essential and at the forefront of our work. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Specifically in the area of education and learning, the team that I work with here focuses on ensuring that all children are ready for school and schools are ready for children. And our overarching strategic goal is to improve the reading and math outcomes and proficiencies of children by 3rd grade. And we do this by supporting the systems that are in place that help children receive the high-quality education by nurturing and supporting families. We have a family engagement team here that, again, focuses on supporting families and communities, engaging them not only strengthening relationships, but building better relationships with schools and families and communities, as well as we focus on the physical and emotional development of children ages birth through 8. And I'm not sure if everyone's aware of that, but we know the Kellogg work, but we've also integrated the education and learning teams with family economic security and our food, health, and well-being teams here at the Foundation. I think is going to be really critical to addressing this in a collaborative way. So as we talk about using a racial equity lens to frame our community work and the work that we know we are all committed to do, the educational movement in this country over the last 20 years has really largely been driven by academia and well-established organizations that are pushing compliance and standard-driven agenda. And we support that, but this agenda is very similar to that we've been doing for a very long time, and we're looking at how we can do it in a very different way. So, for example, the social justice and the racist justice organizations that have been doing great work on behalf of our country, our organizations that have largely for a very long time stayed out of the first K policy space, with the exception of CDF. Many of these organizations have been in the K-12 world. And what we've committed to do over the next 3 to 5 years at the Kellogg Foundation is really claim that birth to 8 space, which spans, again, into the K-12 system, but really identify and strengthen state policy and organizations that can really push a social justice movement in this birth to 8 space. So we're working really to align these two systems, both the racial equity frame, where communities and particularly communities of color have a direct voice, and the policy and the national frame, which really then strengthens our social policy movement. If you go to the next slide, and as I discussed before around this, really investing in social racial justice groups for the birth to 8 practice and policy area, we feel that there's tremendous opportunity here. We find ourselves really trying to kind of retrofit the traditional organizations that have been focusing on early childhood or birth to 3 or this pre-K3 movement to really expand their racial equity knowledge base. But we understand that this is really just half the work, right? Half the equation to really doing this. And we also need organizations who are strong in racial equity, racial justice, and understand the zone, the capacity of where our birth to 8 space is, right? And that special lens when we talk about working with early childhood, not only the children, but the teachers and the families. So we have committed, again, in this space to do more funding and really focus on the disproportionality of policy folks at the table, communities of color, to work largely with women of color in this sector, knowing that the early childhood space is largely dominated by women of color, usually low-wage sectors with little benefits. We are also committed to do work in both large, small, and medium-sized cities across the United States. We found that as we took a collective look, there are many southern states that we have not really dived into a lot of this work. So you'll see a lot of our funding shifting to those areas, as well as, really supporting the groups that we have been funding typically across the board, which are larger national policy groups. And if you go to the next slide, please. So, some examples, again, of this work is, the great data that a lot of organizations that we've been partnering with over the years that have been doing racial and social justice groups and the data that they have and what's being done with this data and how can we effectively transmit this information into local action with a focus on a well-articulated and structural message of change. How can we use, I'll give you, one of the examples that we were talking about really is, Ed Trust has some great data and a lot of national organizations have the capacity to get this, but what's really being done to use this to transmit a different message and what's next for our partners and as we interface this and we have this social movement, we don't want to then penalize the communities that we're working with, and then thus as we're striving for better quality and more space in this area of early childhood, we then don't want schools to be shut down because we're advocating for quality. So, you know, it's a very interesting space that we've decided to move into. I'm very excited about this and just, you know, pushing again towards more social and educational reforms in the birth to educational spaces where we are headed. So, thank you.
Felicia, that was great, and I want to encourage folks to go ahead and jot down your questions. I know I jotted down several after each presentation. We will come back later to a larger group discussion to really facilitate and really integrate some of the questions that are coming up on the queue. Next, we are delighted to have from the Alliance for Educational Justice, the Alliance for Educational Justice, Jonathan Stitt. Jonathan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Sir. Yes, we can.
All right, awesome. So I just want to wish everybody a good afternoon, and really excited to talk to folk about the unfinished business of Brown versus Board of Ed. So again, my name is Jonathan Stitt. I'm the National Coordinator for the Alliance for Educational Justice. AJ, as we call ourselves, is a national network of 29 intergenerational youth-led organizing groups that came together in 2008 to really look at how we could use and amplify our local victories on the ground to change the federal landscape and really advance what our collective vision of education, which is it's the 21st century education that prepares all students for college, career, and beyond. So that's who we are. Most of our groups, all of our groups also come together around a sense of racial justice, education, and young folks. So just a little bit about who we are. We'll go to the next slide. Part of we feel like the unfinished business or the new business after Brown versus Board was just the emergence of the new Jim Crow, or as we have labeled it in school, the school-to-prison pipeline, which is a system of policies, institutional practices that consistently funnel our young people away from educational opportunities into incarceration, and then sometimes even death. And so in the photo there, in the slide, there is, for folks, this was a piece that we used in some of our political ed, and it had Trayvon Martin's name a part of it. And one of the things that we were clear about and what touched a lot of our young folk around that was that part of Trayvon's story was the reason why he ended up at his father's place where he encountered George Zimmerman, because he had been suspended 3 times at a Miami public school system, and his mom trying to figure out an answer, figured that was the best solution. And so I remember vividly when we were together in the conference in Chicago when the verdict came down, and we were sitting with young folk kind of being in the moment, and that was the question that was raised by one of the young people that really sent us spinning and really captured what would happen or where we needed to go with this and the impact of it all. And the student asked, what would have happened if Trayvon hadn't got suspended, but in fact they had restorative justice in his school, and he had been able a way to resolve it, and they hadn't resorted to that. So for us, that in Trayvon's story, there's a real connection between the school-to-prison pipeline and the role schools can play in helping to transform communities or work to their detriment. The other unfinished business, or one of the things, next slide, please, around next to the school-to-prison pipeline, I think one of the things that we're clear about the unfinished business around Brown versus Board is the issue of school closures. And so part of the Brown versus Board was that separate and unequal was inherently unfair. It seems like 60 years later, the system's response to this is to close all of those schools. And we say that those schools shouldn't be closed, that those, in fact, our community assets, and that particularly the recent round of school closings disproportionately hurt Black and brown students and discriminate against them. And I think some of our work now, 60 years later, is figuring out or being able to articulate the new ways that the new Jim Crow and how it continues to operate or operate in new and different ways, and really challenge the notion of what discrimination looks like. I remember one of the conversations we had with Judith in the advancement project around this was really trying to capture the desperate impact and really being pushed for us as an alliance to think about how we prove this under the set of concepts, under the set of laws that currently exist that allow for these types of school closings to happen unmitigated. The next slide. And then for us, part of what Brown versus Board did for us as organizers, that it also helped ignite a civil rights movement. And so the year following the case, we saw an advent of sit-ins, freedom rides, and kind of defiant voter registration drives and other direct actions. And so for us, Brown versus Board planted the seeds of struggle for equality and justice that has ultimately blossomed into the alliance and the work that we do in this broad movement to end the school-to-prison pipeline. And some of the things we hear nationally is this idea around kind of education returning to be the civil rights issue of our time. We would argue that education has always been a civil rights issue in our movement since when we go all the way back, and even looking at the Reconstruction period. Education has been a lightning rod issue in our community that has ignited broader movements of social justice. So education continues to be a central issue for us as a people. I think the last thing around, and where we were at the 50th anniversary, is that Brown versus Board did little to create an equitable education system. As we can see, schools are still separated, still unequal. We know the recent data from the Department of Ed reveals that black students are much more likely than white students to attend underfunded schools with inexperienced teachers that don't offer access to advanced courses in math and science. And then, like we talked about earlier, that the system has come up with new ways to keep black students from attaining educational justice, both through the massive overuse of suspension and zero tolerance policies, as well as school closing. And so for us, part of our vision for education justice in this country extends from the work that happened in Freedom Summer and the idea of schools being a transformative site for social justice and modeling the kind of new world, the new America that we wanted to see. And so education, again, for us is not just about what happens in schools, but about what happens in our community and what happens with our future. If we go to the next slide, I just included some really fun stuff. This was one of our memes that we did around the pre-K suspensions, and this idea, again, that when we talk about these issues, and even in the context of the My Brother's Keeper, that the stats say that school-to-prison pipeline and these issues in Brown versus Board impact us all. And so there's the idea that we all have to come together as a community to address those issues. And then, and so at the next slide, so 60 years later, schools are still separate and unequal, and still work that remains. And for us, if we were asked to think about 3 recommendations for funder allies, and I think our first recommendation is, like we heard from Sister with the Kellogg Foundation, that we really need program officers and foundations to continue to advance the language and the idea of racial equity and continue to put it up on the table. I think there's something very powerful about when funders can talk openly and transparently about race and its impact that liberates other folks to speak their truth. I think the second recommendation is really looking at the South. When we look at school closings and the impact of school-to-prison pipeline and where there is a great need for education organizing, you have to look at the South. Most of young people of color, black young people, are in the South and attend schools, and the reports and the trends all suggest that the South will have the largest poorest and blackest student populations in this country. And so we really need to be ahead and looking at that. And then my last recommendation is for this particular group is to figure out ways to support Black youth and Black youth organizing in its myriad ways, and even in our own sometimes silliness and craziness, but really working with us and really understanding the value of what it means for young people to take charge of their education, of their community, and thinking long range. So even though they kind of transition or might be with us for 4 years, a lot of the research says that young people who begin to organize in the high school and junior high years continue to stay active and into adulthood, and we're clear the impact and what that means. So I thank you, and I think that's my time.
Jonathan, thank you. That was fantastic, and I can't wait to engage in a different conversation with you later on. I thought your 3 recommendations were spot on and look forward to following up. Next slide, please. You will see that you follow very nicely to our next presenter, Judith A. Brown-Dianis, who I'm sure you've known from the Advancement Project. Judith, would you like to take it on?
Sure. Thank you, Alvin. So, hello, everybody. Thank you for having me on the call today. I will say that Jonathan and I think a lot alike, so he took a lot of what I was going to say. But, we are, as he said, 60 years later and still unequal. I mean, I think when we look at the civil rights movement and all of its wins, one of the things that is the tragedy of it all is that when we got those big wins and those big victories of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, of 1965, and of 1968, we, moved away from the movement. And what that meant was that we left a lot of the work to be done to lawyers. And I say that very, ironically, because I am a civil rights lawyer. For those who don't know Advancement Project, we are a next-generation civil rights organization that is multiracial in our approach, and we work with grassroots movements to build power towards eliminating structural racism. And so for us, when we look at Brown v. Board in particular, and 60 years later, it is a shame that we are where we are with a new kind of Jim Crow remnant. And I say remnant because today we still have some of the same issues, just with a different name. So you can move to the next slide. As I said, Jonathan said a lot of what I wanted to say, but, our times now, when we think about where we are in this moment with so many deaths of young people, innocent young people, just because they are people of color, just because they are Black. The school-to-prison pipeline where, I always say mass incarceration starts now in pre-K. And so we're seeing our young people being not only pushed out of school but also criminalized in their schools. School closings, as we think about what is adequate education, in fact, most of our children are finding themselves being labeled as failures because of a failed accountability system, but also being sent to schools, being tossed around from one school to the next. One of the things that has been was really kind of enlightening to me in the work that we did with the Alliance for Educational Justice and Journey for Justice around school closings. When we filed 3 Title VI complaints around the anniversary of Brown v. Board, and we filed those Title VI complaints alleging discrimination against children of color in Newark and in New Orleans and in Chicago. And one of the things that really is sad is the fact that so many young people are going to schools that are labeled failing. They're then sent to another school where all of the teachers and adults know that they came from a failing school, and they are, those individual children are then labeled as failures. Unfortunately, when they get to that school doesn't necessarily get the resources that it needs. And so that school then gets labeled as failing, and it's the domino effect of school closings. And so many children are being closed out of high-quality education as we are seeing more cities turning to privatization and charters. Of course, we're in a time with mass incarceration, and the other sad thing about mass incarceration is that people of color are the ones who put the word mass in mass incarceration. And then voter suppression. As we see changing demographics in America, what we find is that all of the work that was done in Freedom Summer, and for those who marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, we are still seeing times when the clock is being turned back. In our history in this country, if you trace back to the founding of this country, we have always found the vote, actually the right to vote, restricted in times of changing demographics. And so what we are seeing now is actually no different, but it is unfortunate, and as we see more black and brown people becoming citizens and becoming part of our democracy, there is an attempt to make sure that they are silenced. And so you can go to the next slide. And I think what this means is that, and in this moment, that what we have to have is a holistic approach to advocacy. As Jonathan talked about, the organizing work has got to continue. We have got to make sure that we understand that change is going to come from the bottom up. That has always been the way in which people of color have attained success in this country. It hasn't been because someone put a lot of money into changing a school system and gave the money directly to a school system, but it's been because of the struggle of people on the ground who've been able to hold systems of oppression accountable. So what we need to be doing is thinking about building power to change policies, making sure that the voice of those impacted are lifted up, changing hearts and minds. And for those of us who are frustrated lawyers, knowing that we can litigate, but you can't just litigate, that there is more to this. So I wanted to just go to an example of the work that we've been doing in the area of the school-to-prison pipeline. You can move to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So as many people know, the school-to-prison pipeline is both discriminatory school policies and practices that lead to the push-out of young people. It's not just through the discipline, but it's really, when you look at, in many schools, it is about racial bias. Young people who are feared and seen as suspicious and threatening on the street by police officers and others are often seen the same way in the hallways of our schools. And so what we've been seeing is, of course, increased suspensions. We have over 3.1 million students who are suspended a year, disproportionately black and brown children. We know that those suspensions and the arrests that also happen lead to an increase in dropouts and lead to an increase in people going into the criminal justice system. You can go to the next piece. But what we've been doing at Advancement Project is, you can go to the next part of the slide, please. In dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline, the first part that we've been doing is to advocate. And again, I want to talk about the holistic approach, strengthening the capacity of local groups through providing research, communications, advocacy, legislation support, also litigation, and our action camps. Action camps are what we have done is we've worked with some of the best organizers who have been doing the work around the school-to-prison pipeline, and we have trained over 800 young people and students to go back home and do work around ending the school-to-prison pipeline, and we often support many of those local campaigns. And what we're doing is that we're building that capacity so we can organize towards policy wins. You can go to the next piece. When we get those policy wins, we then lift up those policy wins to change public opinion. We know that we can't just win these things and win them in a vacuum. You can go to the next piece. The second part of our work in dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline has been around communications. We know that we have to win hearts and minds. When you look at the civil rights movement, it was organizing, it was law and policy, but it also was about using the media to change hearts and minds, to push the momentum for change. You can go to the next piece. And in the end, what we see is that we have had significant wins at the local level, pushing accountability, but also building the public will momentum for national policy reform. And so when we look at the school-to-prison pipeline, which started with grassroots organizing of parents and young people, being supported by groups like Advancement Project, who have been able to take this issue and not only use it at the local level, but lift it up to change the national discourse. And the communications piece has been very important, because what we have done is that in all of these years we've been doing the work for us from Advancement Project since 1999, what we did was that we set out to make the term zero tolerance unacceptable, so that schools don't use that actual term. But not only do they not use it, but it has shifted their thinking about the actual policies and practices that they're using in their schools. So through really, aggressive media campaigns that go along supporting these grassroots efforts, we're able to see a shift to increasing and improving school environments that are conducive to learning and succeeding. But also, most important, is that in those communities there has been a building of power where young people and parents are now sitting at the table. You can go to the next slide. The last little model I just want I wanted to talk about was using communications in the voting rights context as an example. Part of what we have to continue to do in our racial justice work is, in addition to organizing and the policy work, is around communications. For Advancement Project, for example, in 2012, we were able to, with significant support from the Open Society Foundation, we were able to work with the Brennan Center to come up with messages that would push back on what was happening on voter suppression. Too often young people were talking about voter fraud, but in fact we knew that we needed to have another narrative that pushed back on that. And so what we did was that we did polling and opinion research with the Brennan Center to come up with the messages that would resonate. Then Advancement Project took those pieces and made sure that we pushed it out into the field to create an echo chamber. We have to have an ongoing echo chamber around our issues in order to move the dial. Again, this is about winning hearts and minds in the end. And so in order to do that, we have to be able to communicate not only through traditional media, but social media, to infuse our messaging into popular culture, to make sure that it's coming at people through all different kinds of mediums, so that we are able to make them start thinking differently. When we look at the school-to-prison pipeline, when we look at what we did around voter suppression, now to have the president, for example, actually using the messaging that we came up with in his most recent speech, the Attorney General using that messaging, but also local ministers, local activists. That's the kind of work that we have to do in order to get wins in the end. So I just wanted to sum up with three pieces that I think are very important to what we need to be doing. One is, again, funding and supporting organizing efforts, organizing and advocacy. Unfortunately, in the education work in particular, what we find is that there is very little support for work around education advocacy that supports advocacy and organizing groups. Other than in the area of school discipline, where we've had really significant wins, on all of the other issues, we don't find the kind of resources going into that work to make sure that we can win on these issues. And if you take the school-to-prison pipeline as an example, we know what works. We know how to win these issues, but unfortunately education advocacy does not get the support that it needs, and we're seeing more money going into the actual systems themselves as opposed to pushing from the outside to get the change that we want. Second is we need to, again, make sure that we are funding communications. And third, that we really have to double down on supporting communities of color and being out front on these issues. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Judith, that was excellent. Thank you so much. You laid, I think, a very powerful blueprint for our next presenter. Following up on these themes of organizing, education, voting, and communications, it just makes logical sense that we really spend time with Marcia Smith from Firelight Media. Marcia, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Great. Take it away.
Okay. I'm not going to talk too long. We had initial. Are we going to try to do the video? I hope it works. You all have to let me know if it's working or not. Assuming that it does, I'll just say a word about it. This is a feature-length film about Freedom Summer that is called Freedom Summer. It will premiere on PBS on next Tuesday, the 24th, on the series American Experience. So let's see if we can get it going. It's just a couple of minutes of the film.
Just letting folks know, if you cannot hear it, if you can just please put your speakers on or plug in your headphones to your computer. That may work that way.
Given the power of the film, this is Edward, what we want to do is actually, we can send the link to everyone because it may be because of the browser slowing it down because it's such a provocative few minutes to tease out the film. Why don't we just send it to all of the participants and encourage them to encourage their friends to tune in next Tuesday on their local networks and really boost the interest and the energy around letting folks know about the film. How about that?
That's fine. And with that, should I keep talking?
Yep. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Marcia.
okay. I would love to hear about the toolkit as well, Marcia.
Okay, great. Just to say a word about why we think and hope this film is important at this time. The timing of this film is fortuitous for three reasons. First, of course, it is the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, but the context around what's happening now, I think, has made this history even more critical for people, and that is some of the things we've been talking about already today. The Shelby decision and the attacks on voting rights that has meant, and also the 2014 elections, and the extent to which people are focusing on a whole set of issues that have to do with voting rights and voting, I think, makes the timing of the film more important. And what I think the film does is put in context the kinds of struggles that people are dealing with now. So when you do get a chance to see it, you'll see all the kind of trickery that officials in Mississippi did, the extent that they went to make sure that African Americans would not vote, and the reprisals that they dished out if they tried to register. So, we think the film is an important backdrop for the issues that are happening today. Let me just say quickly a few things that were interesting and a little surprising to us in producing this film. One is the strength and the courage of the people in Mississippi, so that, when most of us hear about the story of Freedom Summer, we hear about the 900 to 1,000 students who went down to Mississippi to register voters, to organize freedom schools, and to organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. What we don't hear about is the people in Mississippi who took up that charge. So, not just Fannie Lou Hamer, but hundreds of others who had the courage to step out of the shadows in a very dangerous situation and were the ones to really step forward and make change, and in fact had the leadership of the students, took leadership. The students had to take leadership from them. The second thing was just how dangerous this was. This was the summer that Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were murdered, found dead in a ditch. This was the summer that other black Mississippians were killed. And people from Mississippi were well aware that people might die, might get driven out of town, would certainly face economic reprisals, might be driven off their land. So the idea that, you know, and this goes for me, I think, for my generation and people who are active now, have to remember just how dangerous it was and the kinds of risks that people took when we get tired and we start to complain about how difficult it is. And the third thing that really impresses me still when I watch the film is how difficult it was to make alliances. You know, these were white students, many of them privileged, were many of the students who participated in Freedom Summer, and they had to form a working relationship with black Mississippians who, you know, each, as far as the other was concerned, came from a different planet. That was not easy to do. It took a lot of work for them to work through their differences in perspective, but at the end they were able to come out with a common commitment and proceed with the work that had a huge impact. So just another word before I end about what we're planning to do with the film. As I said, it does premiere June 24th, which is next Tuesday on PBS. But we're hoping that that is just the beginning of a campaign that will use the film as an organizing tool. So we have been able to raise money from funders to develop a toolkit that includes 5 short clips from the film, along with other educational materials, along with other information about voter registration and getting out the vote. And we are disseminating that toolkit. We're also working closely with a number of groups, including Advancement Project, on events and on pushing out the film and these pieces of the film as educational tools for people who are organizing today around these issues. So I hope you do get to see the whole film. The only suggestions I would leave you with as funders, and this is in full support of all the things that people have said about the importance of funding, organizing, about funding voices from the bottom, and about funding communications, I would say consider investing in documentary films by African Americans, by people of color. These are, I think, indispensable tools for the struggles that we face now in an era where the media are controlled by conglomerates, and we have very little ability to impact, and a very narrow ability to impact the images of African Americans, very little impact to put issues that we think are important on the table, to make them part of the public discourse. And I think that independent film is a way to do that. It's a way you can build campaigns around them. You can take all the initiatives that you can take on your own without having to depend on trying to bust through the common narrative that comes out of mainstream media. I would also agree with Judith that investing in media strategies beyond documentary film is an increasingly indispensable complement to the program work that you do. And the third suggestion is to invest in that relationship between media and organizing. That is part of the work that we're doing with the toolkit. We've done it before. There are a number of other both filmmakers and organizations that are experienced at building, organizing campaigns, educational campaigns that use films as a way to kick off conversations and to spur change. And I'll stop there. Hope you get to see the film.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcia. Just for everyone who's actually listening online or also watching online, please submit your questions to the webcam bar. I am really eager to jump into the richness of what we just discussed, and I would like to have a conversation between the panelists I was struck by a lot of commonality in what everyone spoke about. Each of you brought the space of education and civic engagement closely together. I know some funders really think about education as a gateway theme, or as Felicia said earlier, thinking about these things in a holistic way. And I'm really curious to know from your point of view, why are either advocates and or funders really seeing the integration of education and civic participation? Why is it so valuable? And I can help call on folks if necessary.
Jonathan, I can jump in. I think in our experience, what we've seen is definitely with the first wave of attack around voter disenfranchisement, we would argue has been the dismantling of local school boards and the idea of mayoral control. So we definitely see the connection in the shrinking of democracy coming through the attack on education and, like Judith said, in connected to other issues like mass incarceration starting at pre-K. So we're clear that it gets closer and closer, or starts early and early, so they are connected. Education is a lifeline in our community and part of our hopes and dreams, and so they are connected.
Mm-hmm. This is Judith. I'd add to that. If you look at the work around the school to prison pipeline, right? And let's first of all, civic engagement. Let's for me, it's a broader definition than just voting.
Sure.
I think too often we get caught in the moment of, we just want people to register and vote. So if we look at it in the broader definition of engaging in advocacy at the local level, being there day in and day out at school board meetings, et cetera, what we have found in the school to prison pipeline work is that, that was an entry point for communities. It wasn't like, for Advancement Project, for example, it's not like we set out to do work around school discipline. Is what communities had defined as the issue that they were most concerned about. And so that was their civic engagement entry point. And so I think we've got to figure out where are those entry points. If it's school discipline in 22 cities, for example, which is, Journey for Justice is in 22 cities doing organizing around school closings, that is the entry point. And it's because people do feel passionate about their children. And so, and unfortunately, it's one of those things where it seems like we've missed it as a, at least, in the nonprofit kind of, definitely in the funding world, missed the opportunity to use education as the entry point and to be able to support people on the ground who want to do organizing around it and who will vote, based on their concerns around education issues.
Love it. Felicia, I had a question for you. As you were presenting earlier, one thing that I've noticed over the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years is an increased level of attention around pre-K education. When I was a funder, I didn't think that many people were actually funding in that space as wildly as they are now, but I would love to really hear from you, why do you think people are now investing in the pre-K space? And one of the earlier presenters actually talked about even the prison to pipeline starting at pre-K. So I'm really curious to hear you talk a little bit about why is that significantly new or newer now or getting so much more media attention?
So I think for a long time the challenge started with the K space, right? In the K to 12 world, is like this K space was seen as a space for children, are they ready for school and they're not ready for school? How do we structure? Do they need to be tested? There was a confusion in the K space for a long time. What do we do with these young children as we're getting ready to educate them? And as we looked at data that was being used unfortunately, in our society, in the 1970s, there was a study done around the early achievement gap for young children coming to school ready. And it showed that, boys of color, specifically black boys, were behind as early as K entering school. And so a school readiness model, or I think that was the driving force, right, of getting kids ready for school, which is for kindergarten, and getting schools ready for children. And it really prompted folks to look at what is happening, what is the quality of care and education that's happening before children come into this formal space. We've invested a lot of public funds in this birth-to-5 space, yet children are still coming to school not ready, children coming to school lagging behind. We see achievement gaps in word knowledge as early as pre-K and kindergarten. So I think this movement is a call for us to recognize that there are a lot of, most public fund programs that serve children birth to 5. The majority of those programs are serviced in communities of color, and we're not. There wasn't a strong mandate for those programs to be quality and to have rigorous programs for children and families to support them to be ready for school. And of course, there was always a history of the relationship not being that one of a good relationship with many of the families that were coming to this school and developing relationships, period. So the public fund, there was a campaign, the Pre-K Now campaign that started several years ago to really start having folks pay attention to this space and having more children come ready for kindergarten. And thus we know the early investments in pre-K, the early investments in early childhood, all of the research within the last 5 to 10 years that has showed the long-term benefits, not only financial benefits, but those benefits for children as early as we see as 3rd grade and life. And we wanted to, the movement was to also think about the benefits that we do see in 3rd grade instead of using 3rd grade reading scores to predict how many jails we build. So I think it was a movement across the board to really look critically at the quality of care that children are receiving before they come to school, but also the readiness gaps that we saw as early as in that pre-K space.
I want to borrow something before you go. I want to borrow something that Jonathan said earlier about, because you also reinforced this in your presentation, the framing around racial equity. And I'm curious to know, as a funder, one, has that been difficult to do, to talk about pre-K through the landscape and lens of racial equity? And my second question is, are there existing funder collaboratives or funder roundtables exclusively looking at this issue of pre-K?
I'm sorry, that question was for me, right?
Yes. All right, sorry about that, yes.
No, okay, that's fine. So, there are other foundations that we have partnered with around this racial equity space. I think one of the things that Kellogg is unapologetic is about the fact that we've put racial equity at the forefront of all of our work. And when we talk about race, equity, culture, ethnicity, those are spaces that usually, most likely in many spaces, but specifically in spaces with early educators and just educators, period, when we talk about the dynamics of culture that they face every day when they walk into their classrooms, is a very sensitive space. And, but we don't put that, we don't apologize. We put that at the forefront of our work. We're intentional about that. We do many from conferences to seminars. We work hand in hand with our programs and our grantees and our partners to ensure that they understand what that means to the work and how we view that as a work. And we've taken a hard stand of, going as far as looking at the organizations in which we fund and what they, the practices that they have. And is this something that they're really, really, truly invested in? So, yes, it's a difficult space because I think that, often people are uncomfortable, but we're happy people are uncomfortable because at least that makes us know that they're understanding that this is not something that is an okey doke. This is something serious, and we've made a stance on this. But they're actually thinking about what this really means in the work that they do across the board with children and families. So it's not an easy thing, but it's it's something that we've decided to address.
That's brilliant, brilliant. Marcia Smith, I had a question for you. So people are familiar with some of the products from Firelight Media, including Madam C.J. Walker's story, the affirmative action documentary you guys did, even the Emmett Till doc that you guys did. I'm really curious to know more about how well funded is the film and media space with issues around race, but in particular around African American history and content. I must admit I've never seen any report that's actually elevated in a very clear way how much money goes towards the space of communications or the space around filmmaking.
Yeah. The Foundation Center actually has a report on media funding, but that's, it's media funding kind of all over the map. But, to answer your more narrow question, there's only a handful of donors that fund film in particular. And, that handful, by and large, fund, that's to fund like any kind of film. I would say if there's a trend, it's toward funding for contemporary issues as opposed to history, which is good on one hand because there's plenty of issues that are neglected that don't get a lot of airtime in the contemporary media space. At the same time, I think there are the stories of civil rights history in particular, that are so current and so important, yet have been lost so quickly. One of the comments we've gotten from young people who've seen Freedom Summer is, wow, they didn't realize all that was happening back in Mississippi, and that was just 50 years ago. These are people who are still alive. So the film is driven really by people who were part of making that history and who lived that history. These people are still here. And it just wasn't as long ago as many people think. So, the short answer is no, there's very little money for film, and even less of that goes for people of color filmmakers and for history films.
Marcia, can you talk a little bit also about the distribution strategy? You mentioned that it will air on PBS on June 24th. I'm just wondering, what's been the relationship of getting this material out into the public sphere? The PBS is, I think, very good for that because everybody around the country has to have access to PBS. So the broadcast is important. They will air it several times on public television, and at some point it will be available for streaming on the PBS site. But also, I think, through the distribution of this toolkit, we're hoping that people and organizations will not just see the film, but be able to see it in groups and start to work with the content of the film and discuss what it means for today. So there are multiple ways to see it and get it. Anybody who wants a copy of it now, you can just email me and I can send you one. But after the broadcast, after the first broadcast, it will be pretty broadly available. Okay, thank you. I wanted to return back to Jonathan and Judith, if I may. You two also really spoke to this issue of organizing and the importance of organizing in the space of both education but civic engagement as well. And I'm really curious to know from your perspective, if you're willing to share it, why do you think it's so difficult to have funders recognize the importance of organizing?
That's funny. So I think a few things. One is that in a metrics-driven environment, it is hard to quantify the success of organizing often, right? Because it's not immediate gratification. When you look at what, for example, some of the work that's been done in school-to-prison pipeline area, one of our first partners, Padres and Jóvenes Unidos, in Denver, Colorado, it took us 5 years to get our first win because you can't undo structural racism by organizing for 6 months. And so you have to have a long-term vision for what can be if you are going to invest in organizing. And so that, doesn't fit for a lot of folks who need to see results faster. I think the other problem has been, and I speak this because we have a lot of organizing partners who are not doing well right now, who are racial justice organizing groups who are scrambling for funding. And I think the other piece of it is that many of those organizations are small organizations, and very large institutions, foundations, don't have relationships, number one, with these smaller organizing groups. Two, some feel that those organizing groups don't have the capacity to give them large grants, and I think even for Advance the Project, that when I hear that from funders about, well, you don't have capacity, I don't know how we're ever going to get to capacity if we don't invest in us. And so I think that's the other issue, is that for larger foundations where, and it's also lots of little groups, and so that means managing lots of different grantees, which can, become onerous, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, I'd love to hear your perspective on that question. Why is it difficult to have organizing funded?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of Judith's analysis. I definitely think the time frame issue is definitely important when you talk about projects 5 years. Like when you, as an organizer, just the mechanics of it takes 2 years to build a campaign for it to launch, and potentially another 2 years to win it, and then there's the monitoring year after. And so campaigns usually have a 5-year cycle, and so it doesn't necessarily always sync the way funding works, as well as the metrics. And I think one of the things that, for our end, on reflecting back on community organizing, youth organizing, one of the things that we definitely have to get better at developing and being able to talk about is the transformation and the benchmarks that happen along the way. Because we can quantify the work that we're doing and the impact that it's having along the way, and being able to tell that story and to tell the story of the mom or the moms that, was, went and have grown and developed political acumen and now are able to run campaigns and on some levels grow to lead the very organizations that they came to seek assistance for, being able to tell that story and tell those stories of transformation. So yeah, I think that's the only other
I wanted to add something. Can I add something, Alvin? I think, I think the other issue, and this is, I'm going to put it out there, is like, within philanthropy, we need folks to believe that people of color-led organizations can be successful. Now, I know I'm probably not talking to the people on this phone, they're probably to the choir, but I think that is another issue that we have to deal with in these circles, is the idea that, that we know what we're doing, that we can be successful, that sometimes it's not going to be glitz and glamour for our work, but there's, because there's a process to winning, and so you might not see it on the evening news all the time, but we need folks to believe in us.
Mm-hmm.
Hey everyone, this is Natalie, just jumping in. Thank you, panel, that was great. Just wanted to let everyone know that we do have some audience questions, so if you want, I can start to read them aloud and you can feel free to answer.
Great.
Okay, cool. So let me first, so audience, thank you again for asking questions, and here we go. So the first question is that we have here, excuse me, sorry, it is, for the panelists, how best can funders address the privatization of public schools that is increasing? For example, what type of work to make charter schools more accountable? Panelists?
Jonathan, you want to start?
Sure. I think one of the things that, in terms of charter accountability, I think it's the helping or pushing and helping charter schools really capture what it means to be a public institution. That's what they'll tell you if you challenge them around. They'll say public schools, charter schools are public schools. If they are public schools, then they need to act more like public schools, and we have to figure out ways to be able to provide greater access to folks. I think also when we look at the stats around school-to-prison pipeline and its suspension rates of charters, there's some work to be done there, and I think and being clear around the role they play. I think the other piece around charter accountability is how they play fairly and nicely with public schools. Again, the charters were started as seen as an innovator or incubator to innovate, to bring innovation in public education. Now that relationship has turned to where it seems like charters and public schools are competing, and that's not how it was originally designed. And I think one of the ways it plays itself out is in funding, and public schools will always continue to holler around how when students decide to leave a charter school, that money does not follow them back into public schools, and helps to perpetuate a funding equity problem. So if we all agree around the idea that all young people deserve a quality education, whether it's a public school or charter school, then we have to really work together to make sure that this equity in terms of funding, equity in terms of how students are treated, and equity in terms of access.
Thank you for that. The second question is, for many black elected officials, the place where they got their start was winning a school board race. Closing of low-performing schools, also foreclosure, an entry point for future politicians. How can local groups show the impact of local schools to their sense of community? Panelists?
So I mean, the work that the Journey for Justice Alliance, that's part of the of AEJ, which Jonathan heads up, really is highlighting that. The report that they put out recently called Death by 1,000 Cuts really focused on the important role that schools play as institutions in our communities. Because what we're seeing, and this is really, if you look at public housing and if you look at public schools, there's an undervaluing of the institutions that exist in low-income communities of color. Public housing, where people have lived for generations, there are social networks within those developments that get devalued to the point of them being non-existent. The same with public schools. The fact that those institutions play a role in a community is being, is not even being thought about in what is happening with school closing. So Journey for Justice, for example, focused in their report on what those schools meant to community and the impact on young people who are now being pushed off to other schools. So I think that's the kind of work that is happening in the advocacy circles around trying to tell the real story, and that's about charters too, right? Again, being able to support the people who are impacted is important, because they're the ones who are going to tell the truth and tell the story as it is.
Thank you for that. And we have another question. There are two sides of the argument of POC student success in schools, one faulting the home and the other faulting the schools, the lack of resources, etc. Next year marks the 50th anniversary of the infamous Moynihan Report. Comments were made by each of the presenters on what their respective organizations are doing in the community, and Ms. Dehaney spoke directly to the working mother. What are other organizations doing to support these families in consideration of the fact that new schools in cities like my home, Newark, are closing at a rapid pace? How can these community members who do not have the vocabulary or the tools or advocates to rally around the schools fight back? Panelists? Hello?
So one of the things that the Kellogg Foundation is working on, I think we've been doing this for a very long time, but it's been very intentional for the last 2 years, is looking at the way we approach and define family and community engagement. And we've spent a lot of time stepping back and looking at the definition that we feel that has been for a very long time standardized on middle-class white families, and looking at the harm that we've been doing for many, many years by not looking deeper into what do we really mean when we're talking about engaging families, engaging communities, and looking directly at these disparities. So we have been very intentional about partnering and aligning a lot of these support systems, safety nets in communities to help not only build but strengthen the work from the community level up. And we've also been intentional about finding points of proof, right? The data is out there. We know the things, and not only from the report, but we see the data and we hear the data every day about how our schools are failing, and we understand this and we want to address this. But at the same time, we want to list up points of proof. We want to list up areas in which we know in communities of color, specifically Black communities, that things are going well. We want to help strengthen and build capacities of this organization, that those who were talking on the panel, small organizations that we know have a direct link into those families that we talk about as we sit here in Battle Creek, Michigan. So I think we're reframing and relooking at the way not only we fund, but we address the work, and who are our new partners? Where are the partners that we have to make to ensure that we are finding more, coming from a strength-based approach to this work rather than a deficit model, which we acknowledge that we've worked on from too often.
Well, thank you for that. We're going to transition into the next piece, which are final reflections. So panelists, if you'd like to share any final reflections, Bella, this is the time to do it, and that'll be great.
So good. This is Judith again. Thank you first, everybody, for tuning in. I do think that the work ahead is a heavy lift, but I think that again, we know what works. We know that that through organizing and advocacy and communications work, that we can win some of these very hard battles, but it's got to be sustained. We have to be ready to support it over the long haul. And I think that the more that we do that, we will see those people who engage in these local campaigns will become voters. Many of them are already, and as they become voters, we will start to see a shift in the dynamics in this country. And we can win many of these issues as long as we're there for the long haul and stay with the struggles that are on the ground.
Thank you for that.
I'll close with this final thought of story. I remember one time we were in Chicago, again, right before the verdict came out, and I was in the elevator with about 5 youth organizers, and the teacher, a little white woman, had jumped on the elevator with us and started to engage and talking to them and asking what they were here for, and they explained who they were. And she explained that she was a teacher from Kentucky or someplace, and she expressed, she was like, well, I don't think that things will ever change. And the students kind of looked down, and one student then, he said, I believe. And she said, you believe what? And then the rest of them said that we will win. And I think that is where I wanted that. The students in the Alliance for Educational Justice believe that we will win and will continue on the legacy of expanding democracy through the fight for education, access to education, and really fulfilling the promise that is captured in Freedom Summer, and the idea that we can build schools that educate and prepare all young people for college, career, and community.
Hi, this is Marcia. I too would like to thank you all for joining us. I guess the thing that's on my mind, based on what I just heard, from the last two folks who spoke is, history is a really good lesson for all of us. When things seem impossible, when people get together, they do, in fact, change. And you can't always tell when you're in the midst of it what the historical significance of it will be. We had a screening in Oakland last night. I was not there, but I heard it was fantastic with 1,200 people. And Sonia Childress, our community engagement director, apparently, I heard this from somebody else, stood up in front of the crowd and said, "Watch history and then go make some."
Thank you for that, Marcia. We appreciate everyone for listening in. Edward, would you like to give some final words and thank yous and next steps?
Sure. This is Edward Jones, and again, on behalf of ABFE, we really appreciate everyone. Really special thanks to the panelists that's come together in this conversation and doing some amazing work that we all need to be very mindful of, and we need to be very thoughtful about how we support and celebrate, and most importantly, share this work that's going on, make people aware of the Advancement Project, and make people aware of this film as it's coming out, and make, we got to really be thoughtful about how we let people know about the work that's going on that's affecting the communities in which we support, we believe in, and we live in. This was just another continuation in our summer series, in our series of Third Thursday conversations. So we will send out the slide deck as well as the link to the amazing video to you all. And then I challenge you all to tweet, Facebook, blog, share the information about the film as it's coming out, since you have another advance notice about it, so that we can make sure that we're not repeating the same history as history seems to be wanting to repeat itself in the denial of voting rights that we're experiencing, and then the lack of school advancement, but a retrenchment of school opportunities for our youth. We just came from a conference in Oakland, also around a gathering of leaders. There's some great work that's going on, and we want to make sure that everyone's plugged into it. So make sure you log into abfe.org, get connected to our newsletter. We definitely value any and all members that will join, and we want to continue to encourage you to just spread the word about this work so we can be that much more powerful in how we advance in our own spaces and how we can better collaborate to make for a better community for us all. So thank you all. Thank you again, Alvin, for your work in this. And we hope to see you again at our next Third Thursday conversation.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining in, and the panelists, thank you again for your time and your wisdom. So, again, hope to see you at the next Third Thursday.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Great.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.